Right, hello everyone and welcome to the webinar this morning. I'm Natasha and I work at Wessex Archaeology as the Community Engagement Coordinator. So today we're here to look at Park Street, a site in the centre of Birmingham. So as I said, I'm from Wessex Archaeology and I'll be joined by Dawn from Molar Headland Infrastructure and Emma as well from Wessex Archaeology today. Wessex Archaeology and Molar Headland Infrastructure are both commercial archaeological units, and that means they do archaeology before development happens. So today the site we're looking at is being developed for HS2, and I'm sure you're all familiar with HS2. So you can see on this map, we've got lots of different sites down the map, but Park Street is in the centre of Birmingham, for those of you who don't know. We also have other webinars coming up this week, one on Coleshill Manor, which is just here, and another one on Fosse Way and Mercote March, which you might be interested in. We'll send out the links to those at the end. So HS2 is one of the largest archaeological programmes in the UK, and it involves over 1,000 archaeologists. So I think we'll say hello to both our speakers. Dawn and Emma, are you there?
Hello.
Oh, wonderful. Hello,
hello. Hello.
Hi.
So as I said, Emma is from Wessex Archaeology and Dawn is from Molar Headland Infrastructure, and you'll be seeing more of them during this webinar. So before I hand over to Emma, just to warn everyone that this webinar will contain images of human remains throughout. They will be shown. Right, so I will hand you all over to Emma.
Thanks, Tash. Brilliant. So good afternoon, and thank you for taking the time today to watch this webinar. As Tash said, I'm Emma Carter and I'm a commercial archaeologist for Wessex Archaeology. Now, as archaeologists, we are sometimes quite fortunate to work on sites that might pique the public interest. And for the next 3 days, we'll be delving into 3 different sites, and they're absolutely wonderful. We'll look at these sites through these online webinars as part of the Heritage Open Days. We'll be looking at cemeteries, moats and manor houses, and also prehistoric settlements, eventually spanning over a millennia of history in the Midlands. But we'll begin today with Park Street, and it's perhaps one of the most evocative, tangible and well-known sites across the route of HS2. And certainly, if you live in or around Birmingham, it'll be difficult not to have seen it in the news. Park Street is filled with hundreds of skeletons, hundreds of lives affected by industry, and hundreds of stories of labour and loss. And the archaeological results of Park Street can tell us just as much about the living as the dead, as pestilence and progress went hand in hand at this point in the 19th century. So the map that you can see is from 1843, and you might be able to pick out the church in the centre. Now, the red arrows here, if you look at the one on the left, that's St Martin's, and just next to it, where that red arrow is the Bullring Market Square. Now, the second arrow is perhaps a little bit more important for us in this talk, is on the upper right, and that actually points to Park Street Burial Ground. It's important here that we do point out that Park Street was an area of land specifically for the deceased population of Birmingham. It wasn't a churchyard, because by this point, the churches were already full. Now, towards the end of the 18th century, Birmingham was in the steaming throes of revolution. Its canals and workshops were the vena cava that pumped into its industrial heart. The Industrial Revolution had a big effect upon the city, and we can see Park Street Burial Ground for the first time in Pye's map from 1819. Park Street received its first burial in 1810 and would actually go on to be used intensely for just 63 years, closing to new burials by 1873. Now, the purple lines that you can see in both these images actually demarcate the site boundary of the burial ground, and we can clearly see from its earliest inception that there's a northern area and a southern area. What's important to note about these 2 earlier maps is that the open spaces and courtyards surrounding the park, they will soon become jumbled up in a mass of back-to-backs and workshops by the mid-century. Now, if you move on to some later maps, we've got 2 maps here, one from 1849 and 1889. The earliest one we'll look at first, and it's a map by the Society for the Diffusion of Useful Knowledge, which is a beautifully named and real society in Victorian England. And it shows the city becoming clustered. The Those smaller open spaces have been filled in, and those internal courtyards are becoming more and more crowded with additional buildings. Now, the buildings are still unlabelled, so they could actually represent quite a few different things. They could be commercial, industrial, or even residential in their use. And one of the really important developments at this point in the area is the faint grey dashed line. So if you look at the earlier map, there is a dashed line running diagonally, where Tash is showing now, thank you, cutting across the southern area of the burial ground. Now, this dashed line will become the Great London North Western Railway. We can also see it there in 1889 as actually built. Now, by 1889, as the fin de siècle approaches, Park Street Burial Ground has interred its last body and is now established as a park that we can see in this lovely image here. It has formal pathways, borders, seats, and even a drinking fountain. You might not trust the water quality though. So Park Street Gardens is now labelled up on the maps, and whilst Park Street was an open space, that ordered Tetris style of overlay of buildings and back-to-backs becomes denser. To the east of the park, we've got those back-to-backs like I mentioned, and then also various houses, works and pubs. So with the appealing allure of better jobs and better prospects, people were drawn from rural life into the big city. Birmingham was a city of 1,000 trades, it was the workshop to the world, and so the pool was great and the population was dense. But with these jobs in trades like metalworking, engineering and other very physically demanding work, high death rates abound. Dangers of being horrifically mangled by machinery, bones warped from poor nutrition, as we'll see later. It's probably a result of the terrible pain of all that horrible bones, and even the myriad of diseases that came with living in close proximity to many people were always very, very close at hand. Now, in the 18th century, Birmingham actually received its kind of major swarming influx of people, and the population increased by 900%. Housing standards and sanitation couldn't keep up with diseases like cholera, typhoid and smallpox, as they could potentially sweep through these densely populated areas. People were stacked on top of each other in life and at home, and then they eventually go on to face the same overcrowding in death, as we'll see later with the excavations at Park Street.
So what are we looking at in this image, Emma? It doesn't look very pleasant.
No, it's grim, it's dark, it's crowded, and these poor souls are all suffering from cholera. So the image is actually a woodcut, and it's depicting the ravages of cholera by the National Philanthropic Association in 1850. Now, it's worth mentioning that Birmingham did have slightly better sanitation and more sources of natural water than other of the major cities, but they were still affected by cholera. What we can see here is probably one of the rooms in the back-to-back houses. It's very, very dense with lots of bodies. Some of them are probably hopefully alive at this point, but they all have cholera, and the conditions aren't very good for convalescence and sort of feeling better or well. We can see in the background those windows are broken, there's some damp rags hanging up, there's a very, very small stove to the right, and probably the whole family and then some all bunched up in here. We can see women and babies all just bundled in the same area, and probably quite unfortunately, perhaps the source of their woe is probably to do with the shared water. So at the front of this image, we've got that wooden water butts next to that person's shoes. Now, cholera, all your liquids are coming out, you can't control it, you're very, very unwell. So with this kind of close and densely populated area, I can't imagine that they'll be surviving too well from this image. Now, just as trades and industry were changing, so too were burial practices, and this is the really key thing for Park Street. The traditional manner of churchyard management was for those freshly dead or shrouded bodies to be interred directly into the ground and allowed to decay naturally. And this allowed the bones to either decay enough to be worked into the soil or remove the charnel pits, crypts or vaults made for this purpose.
I've not heard the word charnel before. Can you explain what that means, Emma?
Yeah, so a charnel pit or charnel house, as they're sometimes called, is basically a repository for bodies, and more commonly bones, really, rather than bodies. And it's also a really important part of churchyard management. So areas of the churchyard were rotated to ensure adequate time for nature to take its course. It's a bit like how a farmer rotates their fields. some areas go fallow and rejuvenate, the churchyard will suffer the same space-saving issue. So you had to wait for those bodies to decompose, then when those bones were just bones and not flesh anymore, you could put them into those charnel pits, so they save space. However, changes in funerary traditions to include the permanent use of coffins and permanent monuments made these early traditions almost impossible and unfeasible. So if you think about it, we can imagine that a rapidly increasing population with densely populated areas, with poor sanitation, dangerous work conditions, does lead to very, very high mortality rates. So space is at a premium, and people are dying quicker than their bodies are decaying. So it's quite a grim and grisly world in the 19th century. Now, on describing the state of the churchyard of St Martin's in the Bullring, the English poet, historian and Brumley native William Hutton said in 1738 that the dead are raised up, and instead of the church burying the dead would in time have buried the church. This treacherous and evocative image is the century where Birmingham's population has increased by 900%, but it actually took another 30 years before Park Street Burial Ground was built as a response to the tide of newly dead. Now, the image that we can see, it's beautifully grim, and it's actually one of the skeletons from Park Street, but we can go on more to that towards the end.
And what's in the eyes, Emma?
Sorry?
And what's in the eyes, Emma?
He's got coins. Well, he or she may have, they've got coins in the eyes, and it's a tradition that is kind of firmly entrenched with bodies. We often see it in sort of 19th century images where they're putting coins in the eyes to keep the eyes closed. We might even see it in films depicting more antiquated points in history. There's a very, very keen sense in our English traditions to place coins on the eyes. It can go back to the Romans and the River Styx, but it's probably just been part of our funerary traditions. So death was very, very close during the 19th century, and cartoons like King Cholera on the right and then the ravages of cholera from the Wellcome collection on the left really show the proximity of mortality in day-to-day life. A very popular poem by Emily Browning, Because I Could Not Stop the Death, I do recommend you read it, actually reinforces the pressing fears of mortality as you go about through life. So death and disease were a huge part of your day-to-day life, and Birmingham City of 1,000 Trades was also keen to capitalise on the scientific and the macabre. Surgeons were in high demand, but how could they treat the human body if they didn't understand how it worked? This begins a very kind of dark and tumultuous relationship between death, disease, and the preservation of science and the pursuit of knowledge. So anatomy schools were becoming increasingly popular, and they were responsible for perhaps one of those darker and more dehumanizing professions that was suddenly gaining traction and demand. Two brothers, William and John Hunter, are actually viewed as the men responsible for kickstarting the whole industry of body snatching in the 19th century. They had their own private anatomy school in Covent Garden, and over a 12-year period, it was said that they went through 2,000 corpses, as after all, how could medical students possibly learn if they didn't have the bodies to practice on? But with no legal supply of bodies, the pursuit of science took a very dark turn indeed. So prior to the passing of the Anatomy Act in 1832, the only legal means to obtain bodies was from the gallows. The Murder Act of 1752 allowed the judge in a murder trial to ordain that the body of an executed murderer to be handed to the surgeons for anatomy. So it amounted to a final posthumous punishment for the most heinous of crimes. However, the demand for fresh cadavers was greater than the gallows could deliver, and resurrection men or body snatchers undertook the shady work in the dead of night to deliver the supply of fresh corpses to the rather well-to-do in anatomy schools. Now, providing you could actually stomach this dark and grisly work, a corpse that was still fresh could actually fetch 12 shillings to about 60p, and that was the equivalent of a week's wages for an unskilled labourer. So you can see that's quite high in demand and has a high payoff for these trades.
I have a poll for everyone at this point as well. So I will launch the poll. The question is, how long do you think it took the body snatchers to steal one corpse? So I'll launch that, and I've got multiple choice for you. So have a guess if you don't know, and Emma will reveal the answer in a minute.
So yeah, I think the main thing I would say is bear in mind the financial incentive. One body is the equivalent to a week's wages. However, it's dangerous. If you're caught, there could be quite severe ramifications.
So you want to be quick then?
Want to be quick, yeah, and probably you might feel a bit sick, a bit ill. You might be sort of plagued with moral guilt. All these factors may come into the time it takes to steal the corpse.
I think we have a clear winner with the answer. There's still a few more people voting, but there is a split between the three, but generally 67% of people think it will take under an hour.
Fantastic.
And then about 30% between 1 and 3 hours.
Brilliant. So you guys might make very good body snatchers. So on average, a fresh burial could be exhumed in 30 minutes, and a really good team could exhume 10 bodies in a single night. So whilst well-trained surgeons were in high demand during the day in the 19th century, the cost of their expertise was grim as those high demands transferred to the graveyards at night. Now, this next image that we can hopefully show, it's taken from a really important work of anatomy by a man called Andreas Vesalius. His book on anatomy and engravings from the 16th century is kind of monumental in our understanding of how the human body works. And what I think is really important about this image is the kind of clamoring fervour of those early anatomists in their pursuit of what lies beneath the skin. Now, despite it being the 19th century, that curiosity and clamouring further hasn't abated, probably only got worse. So Birmingham actually had its own anatomist, this brilliant man called William Sands Cox. My colleague Don will be discussing more on him later. And historic records indicate that William Sands Cox opened a medical school in nearby Temple Row in 1825. Remember, the cemetery is open from 1810, and then founded Queen's Hospital in Bath Row in 1841. So as we'll go on to see, the rather posthumous residents of Park Street were perhaps fated to be used in the pursuit of medical knowledge. So within the archaeologically recorded burials that we've excavated through Park Street, 45 skeletons demonstrated signs of dissection and autopsy, with 43 of these recovered from the north area. So that's approximately 60% of skeletons exhibited either active or healed pathology and or trauma. So this beautiful image that we've drawn up specifically for this webinar today is actually of Park Street. So we have a north-south divide. Perhaps if you can look at the details, we can see which side is the north and the south. So in the background, we'll start off with that. We've got some houses and factories. That plume of smoke that you can see cutting through the background is one of the trains from the London Western Railway. There's lots of monuments in the back there as well, so perhaps these people are richer. The gates certainly look finer, and we have towards the gates in the mid-ground, we have a rather sort of Victorian-looking lady, looking very sad in her full mourning habit, watching the burial of potentially a loved one. Well, what I'd really like to bring your eyes to is the shape of the coffin. So one of the more beautiful things, I think, from a grim and archaeological perspective, is the coffin shapes they found at Park Street. One of them was this incredible fishtail shape. It looks quite arts and crafty, so it may lead more towards trends and ideas and what sort of fashions, really, of what coffins could look like. But also there's potentially the idea to stop body snatchers pulling out the body from either end. I think if it's a fishtail shape, you've got a pinch point. So you might just get the feet or you might just get the head. You're probably unlikely to get the whole cadaver itself. Now, in the foreground, things are a little bit more nefarious. We've got some hoodlums leaning up against the broken entranceway to Park Street. What's really interesting is that some of the historical records we have for Park Street talk about sloggers, and these are the early gangs. And we do know that Birmingham perhaps has the most famous gangs with the Peaky Blinders. So these sloggers were the precursor to the Peaky Blinders. But so far they've just got bottles in their hands, not shivs in their hats. And I also want to draw your attention to the rather sad affair of the kind of no nonsense, no fuss in burial that's happening here. If you see the burial, the coffin itself, it's very, very plain, it's wooden, and there's a very, very plain headstone. So what we're suggesting through this image is that anatomists like William Sands Cox, once they were finished with the body, they were burying them within the grounds of the burial ground itself. And Don will actually go into a bit more detail. And the last thing I'd like to point your eye to, which is my favourite bit in this image, is the sort of sad and slightly ravaged mourner. And the implication here is that she may have syphilis, so she may have a rather nefarious nighttime job entertaining the people of Temple Row, and perhaps she's had to pay for the cost of the funeral by donating a loved one's body to anatomy into science.
And how can you tell she might have had syphilis, Emma?
So syphilis is grim, and the final stages, so tertiary syphilis, as I can show you in later slides, actually starts to affect the bones. So if you watch the film The Libertine with Johnny Depp, he says, "You will not like me" at the start, and his nose eventually falls off at the end of the film. It's because syphilis is just riddled in getting into his bones and slowly eating away at his body. So it's very unpleasant.
Okay. Maybe we can see it in the jawline.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it's starting. So she's got tertiary syphilis there, and it's starting to eat away at that kind of those more fleshy bits, and you would be able to tell that that's the disease that she had, and she'd probably be judged quite harshly for that in Victorian society. It's a very sad time.
I like to think that these people here are waiting as well. They're looking at the body and thinking we'll come back later tonight.
Yeah, it is a possibility, isn't it? Now we also have it. We attached hopefully a time lapse. Is that right? Lovely. So we can still see the results of the Park Street excavations themselves. What we're looking at now is the northern area. So the excavations revealed that both sides of the site, so the north and the south, were distinct in terms of their stratigraphy, so that's the different layers, and the archaeology. Generally, both areas, the north and south, demonstrated pre-burial ground archaeology, 19th century burials, and numerous layers of overburden. So we started to see kind of a bit like a human trifle, the different layers of people stacking up through time. However, the north area demonstrated several layers of made ground holding multiple phases of burial, whilst all burials in the south were cut directly into the natural geology. I've got a slide later that will show you how heavily they're stacked, but we really are seeing how the bodies are just stacked one on top of each other in the north, whereas in the south, we see in this image here, it's far more ordered. So all those circles, as you probably guessed by now, are the graves and the burials. And in this one, we can start to see the family crypts, more evident of those monuments from the south area. So the family crypts, if you just look for the little squares there, so they're basically brick vaults. We can show one a bit later. So the north area, as I said, is relatively disorganized burial ground layout, and there was occasional intercutting of burials alongside just a single brick tomb, whereas the south area had a well-organized burial ground layout with very distinctive grave cuts and little intercutting of burials alongside multiple and varied brick burial structures. So both sides of the park also have been subject to landscaping in the past, with each half demonstrating considerable overburdening, so extra soil going on top of it. So to summarise, the north is poor, has haphazard graves, and one funerary structure, and lots of signs of medical experimentation and dissection, whereas the south is better off, it's well ordered, and has larger funerary structures that denote wealth. So this, I think, is a collection of images. And Tash, you were asking about syphilis. So, so this middle, if you look here in the middle, we have the skull. It's a female skull with tertiary syphilis. And if you don't know if you can sort of pick out the way her cheekbones and her jaw, and she certainly doesn't have any teethless, it's almost like sort of the syphilis has kind of smoothed down those bones and eroded it away. We also have the brick tomb on the left. Now, this brick tomb was actually found in the northern area, so that's quite interesting. So the northern areas has been more poor, but there's still a brick tomb. And one of the things that I find is kind of a very, very soft and kind of tangible element of how the Victorians viewed death is this lace pillowcase that was found in one of the burials, in one of the coffins. So there's an element of kind of like mourning culture, memento mori in the 19th century, and the place is quite nice. There's a level of reverence and care for their dear departed by this quite ornate lace pillowcase. And from an archaeological point of view, it's very exciting that they can find materials like this still intact. So we were saying how the dead are basically living on top of each other. Things are pretty stacked in this image. So we can see that there are two phases of the burial grounds, I believe it's in the north. So we can see that they're burying coffins one on top of the other, which does suggest that multiple people were being buried in any one day. And to get a glimpse of what that actually looks like on the ground, so the image here on the right, it's not a man with very, very long legs or a skeleton with very long legs. It's actually, in fact, two graves. And we can see there the earlier grave on the bottom, we just have kind of from his thighs down to his toes. And then the later one, so the later one's higher up, and we can see their full body there. So there's just inches of soil between the two of them, which really shows that kind of the shambles of day-to-day life, where you're living back to back, one on top of the other, like in that room full of cholera. Even in death, you don't escape it. There's always no space. So to go with a bit more detail now about some of the more intriguing and macabre images relating to Park Street, we have the wonderful Don.
Hello, Don.
I shall now turn off my webcam and hand it over to you.
Thank you, Emma.
Thank you very much. Well, as Emma has already said, the use of the Park Street burial ground covered a period of massive population growth, really, where industrial expansion sucked migrant workers into towns such as Birmingham in search of improved circumstances, trying to improve their living conditions and find work. I'm a human osteologist, so I basically study human bone and skeletons, and we're going to look at some of the things that we found at Park Street and some of the interesting skeletons and some of the pathology and also instances of what we call post-mortem modification. So basically, the influx of people into Birmingham in the late 18th and the early 19th century continued onwards into Victorian times. And what this meant was people would have this transformation from a traditional rural lifestyle, and it would be a sort of cultural and technological shift away from that lifestyle to a more urban life. And this meant changes in working conditions and living conditions, changes in the timetable of life, the day-to-day timetable and everyday activities that would have impacted on the physical and mental health of the migrants in Birmingham. Now, urban life in itself, it brought its own challenges. We have basically a huge, dense population, something you wouldn't see in rural settlements. And what this meant was that people were crowding together, and this left them vulnerable to the spread of communicative infectious diseases, things such as influenza and measles and tuberculosis. Generally, the poor in particular crowded into the centre of Birmingham because this is where the work was. And what you found there was basically low standards of housing, inadequate sanitation, poor ventilation, and increasing levels of pollution from, say, steam engines and other industrial processes. This is in contrast to the wealthy inhabitants of Birmingham, who of course could afford to move out of the centre into the new suburbs where they could breathe fresher air. Now, when it comes to pathological conditions, we can look at how the lives, the domestic lives and the working lives of the individuals in Birmingham may have been affected by their surroundings, their environment and their circumstances. We know that Birmingham obviously was renowned for its industrial manufacture, in particular metalwork. So anything ranging from toys to guns to jewellery. Birmingham still has a large jewellery quarter today. They're also world famous for the production of buttons, and we found several old buttons during the excavations at Park Street, including button wasters from where they manufactured the buttons from the shells. This kind of work was really very intensive, very repetitive, and often very highly skilled. It entailed long hours of working in little workshops for which Birmingham was famous. And it meant that more and more people spent more and more time indoors. And a lack of exposure to sunlight hinders the metabolism of your vitamin D. And what this means is that you start to suffer from vitamin D deficiency. And actually, we see examples of this in Park Street, in the burials, particularly in the poorer northern area of the ground. And what we see in particular is childhood rickets. Now, childhood rickets is where there's not enough vitamin D to properly mineralize the bones. The bones need to be tough because they're a protective skeleton for the body, but there's not enough vitamin D to properly mineralize the bones themselves, and this means that they're a bit soft and they can bow or bend under the weight of the body. And the bones that take most of the weight of the body, of course, are the legs. So we tend to see this bowing and bending of the thigh bone, the femur, and the lower leg bones, the tibia and the fibula. And this is showing that these individuals were suffering from vitamin D deficiency. And it didn't just cause bowed legs. I mean, it was important for numerous parts of the body, including things such as keeping a good level of immunity, keeping your immune system healthy so you could resist infectious diseases. So this had severe consequences for the individuals at Park Street. We also see evidence of vitamin D deficiency in adult skeletons, and this is known as osteomalacia. And this could also cause bending or curvature of the long bones. But we also see examples of where the poor bone strength has weakened the thinner bones of the skeleton, such as the scapula. And this can lead to small, what we call microfractures. And these result from very minor trauma that can still cause these little cracks and fractures to these thin bones. And we can also see the difficulty that these little fractures have had in trying to close up and heal. And again, this is related to the vitamin D deficiency. There's not enough vitamin D to mineralize and to close that wound. So we get these types of fractures in these thin bones. And rickets became a real problem from the 18th, 19th century. As people crowded into towns, they were all in an area of dense occupation with reduced sunlight, increased pollution. They weren't getting enough vitamin D, spent too long indoors. And really, it got worse and worse throughout the 19th century. And although things improved in the 20th century, vitamin D deficiency is on the increase again because of our sedentary lifestyle and the fact that we're spending more and more time indoors on our computers. So sometimes these diseases do come back to haunt us. One other thing just to point out on this slide is you'll have a picture of a rib. Now, this relates to lower respiratory disease, and this is something that we've also found in the north area at Park Street. What this is new bone growth on the inside of the rib cage, and this is caused by inflammation of pleura that surrounds the lungs. The lungs have been irritated by possibly pollutant particles that have got down into them from the industry, or perhaps we know that sometimes these lesions can be caused by specific infectious diseases such as tuberculosis. And tuberculosis in particular was rife in English towns at this time. It was endemic, and it was a major killer. So again, this is telling us about the health of the urban population of Birmingham in the 19th century. Now, if we look at the next slide, this is interesting to see because we often talk about the working conditions and the domestic conditions causing ill health in past populations. But we forget sometimes that habitual activities and habits and customs can also affect your health, and none more so perhaps than smoking, and in this case, pipe smoking. And luckily enough, in archaeological remains, it can be quite easy to distinguish individuals who have been smoking a pipe in the 19th century in particular, because labourers often tended to smoke short pipes, which they could clench between their teeth all day long while they carried out their jobs or activities. And this would leave huge gaps in the dentition, as you can probably see. In some cases also, we get to see the results of the burning of tobacco. In the case of this individual, where we have the teeth, on the inside of the dentition, we see these brown marks, which are tar stains from the burning of the tobacco. We also tend to notice that individuals who have these signs of pipe smoking also have more rib lesions. And of course, this just tells us what we already know to an extent, in that smoking is bad for your health. So this is another way that we can look at the health of the people who were buried at Park Street. Now, something that we'll see in the next slide, we call it post-mortem modification. This is where something has been done to the skeleton following the death of the individual. And with the medical advances of the 18th and 19th centuries, we start to see more and more examples of autopsy in burial grounds. Now, autopsy is the medical investigation of the body after death in order to determine the cause of death. It's a fairly standard procedure that hasn't changed much over the years, and it's fairly easy to recognize in archaeological remains. That is because as part of this process, the pathologist often needs to inspect the vital organs. And this will involve, for example, having to get access to the brain. In order to do this, they have to saw around the skull and take off the top, take the skull cap off basically, to inspect the brain of the individual to see if there's anything wrong with it. And this is fairly obvious in archaeological remains. As you can probably see, we've got a big saw mark through the top of the skull. More subtle changes might involve small cuts to the front of the chest, in particular to bones such as the ribs, the clavicles and the sternum. Now this represents the pathologist opening up the front of the rib cage, which they would then remove, and this would allow them to examine the internal organs of the chest, such as the heart and the lungs. Now, as I say, this was becoming a more and more common procedure in the 19th century, and we had about 150 cases of autopsy from Park Street out of the 4,000 burials studied so far. So we expected to find cases of autopsy. However, one thing we didn't expect to find, we're going to see in the next slide, and this is anatomical dissection.
And can I just ask, John, before we move on,
sure.
This line here, I can just pick out another line below the craniotomy line. What would that be?
Yes, Natasha, that's quite a good spot, actually. That's a very interesting point because, as I say, we have to have 150 examples of these craniotomies at Park Street, and they're not all the same. They can vary quite a lot. Sometimes we have very clean single saw marks going through the cranium at a regular height, very neatly done, real professional job. On other occasions, we have craniotomies that are quite wonky, quite uneven. They might be higher on the right side than on the left side. It's almost as though someone is practicing or being taught the process. And of course, at medical schools, you'd have trainee doctors who would have to learn how to do this. And it would take a while to get the technique. And this particular extra mark that we see on the cranium in this case is what we call a false start. And anyone who's sawn a bit of wood, trying to, they want to saw a wood in a particular place, will know what this feels like. You're trying to saw through a plank or something, and you get the wrong part, and you have to take the saw out and then stick it back in and try and get it in the right place and continue. So basically, that's what's going on here. They started and they've gone, oh no, I've just started a bit low. I don't want to go that low. I don't need to go that low. I want to shift it up a bit and saw through the cranium. So that explains that, I think. Anatomical dissections. Now these are a bit similar to autopsies in that you often get cuts in the cranium and in the front of the chest. However, the way we can distinguish these from autopsies are that we often get numerous other cuts and in many other different parts of the body. And the reason for this is that these were bodies that were supplied to medical schools to train doctors. And this was an essential part of the training of any doctor and an important part of a course. So medical schools really had to put on an anatomy class. And there were a certain number of students and a certain number of bodies, and they had to divide up the bodies to groups of students so that they could study them. And often this meant dividing up, taking one leg off or another leg off or an arm off and giving it to a set of students and asking them to dissect it and to investigate the muscles, etc. And this is why we get numerous cuts on some of these dissections. Basically, as part of the medical teaching, you have to know about the structure and the anatomy of the body. And the dissection really is the best way of informing you of the structure and function of the muscles and the joints and the organs of the body. And actually, some of the techniques of dissection and of anatomical study are quite old. We found, for example, a cranial bisection, which is a cut in the skull, which allows you to inspect the anatomy of the cranium. And this particular cut is illustrated actually by Leonardo da Vinci back in the 15th century. So some of these techniques were centuries old. And it wasn't just the study of anatomy that these bodies were used for. Another thing that they were commonly used for was actually for the practice of surgery. If you're a trainee doctor, it's handy to be able to practice your skill on someone who is dead rather than someone who's living. For example, limb amputations. If you want to carry out a limb amputation, far better to do that, do such a risky operation first on the body of a dead person before moving on to someone who is alive. Now, once the medical school had finished with the anatomical dissection of an individual, they were supposed to put the different parts of the individual back together and send them for burial. And we find some examples of this at Park Street, where the individual has been put back in anatomical position, with only the cut marks portraying the fact that they have been dissected before burial. However, we also find instances where there may be, say, one arm missing or leg missing. They haven't quite got all the body back together. And in some cases, we've actually got quite mixed up individuals where body portions have been put back in more random fashion. And sometimes there's perhaps more than one individual mixed up together in the same burial. And it's important to remember that we see the skeletal evidence, but actually many of these body portions would have gone back into the coffin fleshed, or at least partially fleshed. And they were put in coffins and buried at Park Street. For all intents and purposes, they were given a normal burial in a normal coffin in the normal area at Park Street. They just happened to be in the poorer north area of the ground. So that's particularly interesting because in previous excavations where we've encountered dissected individuals, it's always been in hospital burial grounds. It'd be very unusual to find them in a parish ground. And you do have to wonder whether this kind of activity was officially sanctioned or not. Now, if we go to another example of dissection, we can look at this one. This is a particularly interesting example that we found back in the winter of 2017 during the evaluation, the initial phases of investigation at Park Street, where we dug a few test pits just to see what the ground conditions were like and to see what kind of level of preservation we had in the burials. And in one of the trenches, we found this real surprise. It was an adult male individual, and I don't know whether you can see or not, but both of the hands had been sawn off, presumably to be used by students to look at the structure and anatomy of the muscles and the joints of the hand. In addition, the left foot has also been sawn off. Probably for the same reason. They left the right foot there for some reason, so they obviously didn't need that. Now, perhaps the most interesting thing about this skeleton is that they had laid the body onto its front, and then starting either side of the neck, they had sawn down the sides of the vertebrae through the ribs, down through the pelvis, and this allowed them to remove the spinal column. And presumably this was for basically to create a model of a spine for anatomical display and anatomical teaching. You sometimes see spines hanging up, plastic spines hanging up in orthopedic wards, and people who basically treat back injuries, for example, they might have a plastic spine up with all the vertebrae hanging from a pole. And this seems to be the same idea, although I've never seen it before in archaeological remains. So this is a really interesting case, and what made it a bit more interesting in archaeological terms was that we didn't recover the head or some of the top part of the skeleton, so the right scapula and the clavicles. We didn't get those either. That's because we were only digging a small trench, and the top part of this skeleton actually went beyond our limits of excavation. So I had to wait a year to go back to site when we had the main excavation, the open excavation, and hunt down the rest of this individual. And you can see in the picture that we did find both clavicles, we found the right scapula, and we found the skull. And I was on particular lookout for the skull because I was interested to see whether they'd removed the skull with the vertebral column, but obviously they hadn't. They'd dissected the neck vertebrae away from the skull and left the skull in situ, removed the spine. I assume they packed the body cavity perhaps with some organic material to keep everything in place, and then put it in the coffin and buried the individual. So this is a particularly interesting example, and I'm just going to show you one more example in the next slide. And this is of a dissection where again, an adult male, and what they've done is in a way they've disjointed this individual. They've removed the arms at the shoulder joints, and they've removed the legs at the hip joints. They have actually replaced the arms and the legs, but not in an anatomical position. You can see them below the pelvis towards the bottom of the slide. So that's interesting in itself, but what's also interesting in this individual is that we've got a rare example of a dissection tool left in situ in the left shoulder joint of this individual. And this looks like a metal probe, would probably have been used to reflect the muscles and the tendons around the shoulder joint during the dissection. And it seems to have broken into two pieces, and perhaps this is why they left the tool there rather than recovering it before the burial. And we know that the students in Birmingham normally had to buy their own instruments, and this particular one may well have come from Salt & Sons on Corporation Street, which is still in business today. Now, the story of these dissections can really be traced back to the advances in medical science in the 18th and 19th centuries. And in particular, in this case, to the rise of the medical schools in the first half of the 19th century. There was money to be made in this practice. Doctors needed to be trained, and you could charge high fees for recruiting them and teaching them and giving them a medical course, and then they could go on to earn their living being doctors. And as I said before, part of this training, this essential training, was looking at the anatomy, and this normally involved dissection of human cadavers. The only problem was, as Emma's already said, was that there was a shortage of bodies with which to do this. And that's because the only people who could legally be dissected were those who had been convicted of murder and sentenced to death and dissection. This meant that there were an awful lot of anatomy schools, medical schools, looking for corpses, but a very, very small supply. And this, of course, led to the rise of the gangs of the body snatchers or resurrectionists, who, of course, caused public disgust. If you can imagine going to bury your loved one, and you can imagine that you really weren't sure whether a couple of days later or the night after someone would come along and dig up your relative, take them to a medical school where they'd be laid out on a table and then cut into pieces. So people had a genuine fear, a realistic fear of being dissected, of being taken from their graves and dissected. So the government eventually had to act, and they decided that what they would do was try and increase the supply of bodies for anatomical study, and they hoped that would put off the body snatchers. The way they did this was to pass the Anatomy Act of 1832, which sanctioned the dissection of individuals who were unclaimed at death. So these would be people such as vagrants, the poverty-stricken, those without families, or those who came from families who were too poor to afford to pay for a funeral and relied on the state. And there's a real fear. People knew that their relatives might be dissected. So what they tended to do was to get together in what they call burial clubs and put their money together, and then if one of your relatives died, you could use that burial club, the money from that burial club, to pay for your relative's burial. So people had a real fear, and basically, because in effect the Anatomy Act sanctioned the dissection of the poor, this meant that many of the people came from the poor institutions, people who couldn't afford burial, people who were unclaimed. So we're talking about workhouses, prisons, and some hospitals. And in all this, of course, we want to find out what happened specifically at Park Street, because we don't know exactly where these burials came from, but we suspect it was from the Birmingham Medical School, as Emma's already said, opened by William Sands Cox in 1825. Cox originally came from Birmingham, but he trained in London. He didn't like his training in London. He said that the London medical schools were unchristian in their practices. So he returned to Birmingham to set up his own. And this worked fairly well because, again, as Emma said, they kept having to move to larger premises to expand for the number of students that they were taking in to study anatomy. And there's no doubt that in the course of the 19th century, this taught a vast number of doctors about anatomy, improved their skills, and contributed to medical science. But unfortunately, of course, it came at a cost to the poor. And really, it's just a reflection of the conditions at the time, where the state was taking more and more power away from the poor and the vulnerable. But we're going to do more work on these dissections at the analysis phase of the investigation, and we hope to come up with a lot more evidence and a lot more interesting stories about these people in Birmingham, because we don't know their names, but we're hoping that this work, particularly with the dissected, the poorer individuals, will help us to be able to tell some of their story. So I'll pass back to Natasha for now.
Thank you, and we've got time for questions now. So pop your questions in the box and we'll do a Q&A. So there you go, that's how to post your questions if anyone's forgot. I've had quite a few questions throughout, so we've got lots to get through. But just for me, so people had to be not only worried about the resurrectionists stealing their bodies, but at Park Street, they could also be dissected before they were buried, and then no one might ever know.
Well, this is the thing, because there was the fear of being dug up by the resurrectionists. But as the operation became smoother in a way, especially after the Anatomy Act, because they could get bodies legally from workhouses, actually it was a case of someone like an operative at the workhouse, the overseer, or perhaps in a hospital there'd be the porter, would be making a bit of money on the side, and sometimes quite a bit of money on the side, by organizing the bringing of a dead person, someone who had no family, who was unclaimed, bringing that to a medical school for dissection. So actually it became a kind of body trade, and perhaps this meant there was less and less body snatching, because people could get hold of bodies in other ways and you wouldn't have to dig them up again. You still have to pay for them, but you'd miss out the middleman, so to speak. So these people, many of these people may have been dissected before they were buried, rather than buried and then dissected later.
How fresh were the bodies as well that the body snatchers were digging up?
Oh, fresh bodies were, they wanted the body to be as fresh as possible, for several reasons. Firstly, obvious reasons, that the fresher a body is, the more it resembles a living body, which is the one you have to work on. Also most of the dissection classes took place in winter when it was colder, because that would slow the deterioration of the body. The fresher the body was, the more the pleasant it was to dissect. You didn't want a body that had really started to decompose badly, because that would be particularly unpleasant to work on. So it was the fresh bodies that were particularly in demand.
And on the theme of bodies and decaying, I've got a question for Emma about the charnel pits and how long the bodies would be left in the charnel pits before they would then be moved.
Okay, so I mean, it depends if so you need to wait for the natural decomposition to occur. So I think Don, do you know how long that would take for a body to in normal soil conditions?
If a body's buried, then it just depends on the soil conditions. And actually, soil conditions don't just vary between cemeteries. They vary within cemeteries and sometimes within graves themselves. So you might get one part of the skeleton that still has flesh, another part that hasn't. So there's really no particular amount of time that you can guarantee a body will become skeletonized in the ground. It just depends on the conditions. So there's a real variable.
Yeah, and so with that variability, you could potentially anticipate that the graveyard warden would have an idea of which parts of the burial ground, perhaps of the churchyard, work quicker or more efficiently. So there's lots of different factors there. But essentially, once those bones are ready for those charnel pits, sometimes you see in places like the Bone Church in Prague. That's a very, very beautiful charnel house, and they'll use those bones to decorate it. You also see it in the catacombs below Paris. So it depends on how densely populated your charnel pits are, what the pressures are on how many people need to bury there. But generally in the UK, we are seeing kind of charnel pits as an efficient way of managing the dead, not as kind of ornate ways to decorate in a macabre or Gothic manner. So in answer, it varies and it varies.
Thank you for that answer. Another question about decaying. People are liking the decaying theme. Did you find any coffin wood, Dawn, in the excavations, or was that all lost?
That is a very interesting question, actually, because we had different burial conditions on the north and the south sides of the ground, and it really does vary considerably. Sometimes you'll find very, very intact coffins, but at Park Street, we found mostly degraded wood. Most burials had some remains, but normally it was very, very degraded wood, or it was a stain in the ground, or you would get some metallic fragments from the coffin plate that had the name and the date of death and the age of the individual written on the top of the coffin. So very, very poorly preserved, and fragmentary. On the south side of the ground, we had a few coffins that were reasonably well preserved, but in general, the preservation of the coffins at Park Street was pretty poor.
So I had another question about when the skulls have been removed from their bodies, how can you tell that how can you pair them all back together? How can you tell that the skull belongs to the same person as the spine or the hands and the feet? How can you tell that?
That's a great question, actually. It's certainly a osteology question. And basically, the more complete a skeleton is, the more you have, the easier it is to fit it back together again. There's lots of bits of the skeleton that often you cannot be sure that they belong together, particularly if they come from different burial contexts. If they've been found in different graves and you're trying to reunite them, it's something you have to be very careful about, because you don't want to combine two different people. And of course, we're all fairly similar. We've all got fairly similar skeletons, so you can easily make that mistake of putting the wrong head on the wrong body, which you don't want to do. So basically, if you have got a suspicion that a head, a skull, might belong to a body, then you want to find the first cervical vertebrae. That's called the atlas, and that sits right at the top of the spine underneath the skull, and there are a couple of facets, what we call facets, articular facets, that articulate with the base of the skull. And you can look to see how well those facets fit together. And if they don't fit together very well, you know it's certainly not that person. If they fit together very well, then you might have the same person. But you have to be very, very careful with these things. As I say, you don't want to put two people back together on one body.
And there's been so many questions. I'm very sorry if we don't have a chance to ask your questions, but I will try and get through as many of them. We have overrun slightly, but we'll just continue to get through a few more of the questions while people are still interested. Can you say anything about the split between male and female, or child and adult, that was found at Park Street? Maybe Dawn.
Yes, we found usually you get more or less equal males and females in these cemeteries. We had a few more males than females. I think particularly on the poor side of the ground, because we're quite lucky. So we've got these two halves of the burial ground, so we can compare one with the other. One we think was richer than the other. And on the poorer north side of the burial ground, we have a greater number of male burials compared to females than we do on the southern, the wealthier side. So the wealthier side had a more even balance of males and females. And what we think perhaps is going on is that we have male migrants coming into Birmingham and working there without their families, and more deaths of younger males working in these workshops. And perhaps they were more vulnerable to earlier death. Under some circumstances, males are more vulnerable to infectious disease. But really, we need to do more investigation to find out exactly why there are these differences. And we hope to learn more about when we carry out the full analysis of the skeletons themselves. It's in a way it's the same with the children in the burial ground. We find many more young children in the north area of the ground, and at the moment we're taking that to be a sign that this was a poorer area and there was a higher child mortality and infant mortality affecting the poorer groups of those who lived in Birmingham, and that would perhaps explain the greater number of child burials in that northern poorer area.
Okay. Another question, and I think it might be, again, this will come later as you do more research, but have you been able to identify anyone yet?
Very few so far. We have, I think, a couple of inscriptions. We have some nameplates on coffins from the south area of the ground. On the tombs, say we have inscriptions, not necessarily always the bodies themselves, because we have the tombstones, but some of them have been moved. So we have the names, but we don't have the skeletons. And in very few cases, we have the name on the actual nameplate on the coffin itself, and in those cases we do have the name skeleton, but very, very few, because of the poor survival of the coffins. So we have a few names, and we're going to look more into their background, into their profiles and their biographies, and build up a picture of the people who were buried there.
And what will happen to the to all the artifacts and the bones and the bodies that you found?
Well, the human remains will be reburied. The other artifacts, I think it's probably still being decided exactly what's going to happen to those, but they will be being conserved, and they'll go to the fine specialists, and these are people who specialize in pottery, in metalwork, in fabrics, in coins, in all kinds, and they will do a detailed study of those finds, and produce reports and enhance the story of the people who are buried at Park Street.
Thank you. I think most people's questions have, at least we've touched on them, I'm afraid, if we've not had a chance to answer them fully. The very final question I'll ask, Dawn, is about the kind of idea of donating your body to science, and when did that come in history? Is that quite a recent idea?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know when the first example was, but I'm guessing it was 19th century. I don't know the answer to that one.
There we go, a great question to finish on then.
Yeah, I don't know who came up with the idea of the voluntary donation. Maybe I should know, but I'll have to have a look, see what I can find out.
Right, thank you very much for answering the questions. Lots of questions there. The final thing to say is thank you for watching. We do have 2 other webinars this week, and I know HS2 are doing lots of other webinars for the Heritage Open Days, so have a look at the Commonplace website for all the different webinars. There's also a television programme which you might all be aware of on BBC, and it's starting tonight on BBC 2 at 9 o'clock. And Don here will be in some of them. He won't be in tonight's episode, but next week's is a 3-parter. He will be in next week's talking about Park Street, and the week after. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
So it's celebrity now. But I think that's all we've got time for. Right, so I will leave you with the feedback links, and hopefully see some of you tomorrow. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.